On a cold desert night in 1882, a struggling single father named Eli Tucker found a confused elderly woman wandering near his barn, lost and shivering under the Arizona stars. Despite barely having enough to feed himself and his young daughter, he gave her shelter for the night. What he didn't know was that this frail old woman was the mother of one of the wealthiest cattle baronesses in the territory, and his act of kindness was about to change his and his little girl's lives forever. Before we dive in, what time are you watching this? Where are you from? Drop a comment below and let us know. With it, the bite of an October night that cut through worn clothing like a knife through canvas. The moon hung low and pale in the star-scattered sky, casting long shadows across the weathered buildings that made up the struggling town on the edge of civilization. Eli Tucker lay on his narrow cot in the corner of his one-room cabin, his calloused hands folded behind his head as he stared at the rough-hewn ceiling beams. Sleep wouldn't come, despite the bone-deep exhaustion that weighed on him like a pack full of stones. His body ached from another grueling day of work, 10 hours mucking out stalls at the Henderson Ranch, followed by an evening shift serving whiskey and breaking up fights at the Silver Spur Saloon. The cabin was sparse and cold, with gaps between the wooden planks that let in fingers of frigid air. A cast-iron stove sat in the center, its fire reduced to glowing embers that provided more light than warmth. In the small alcove separated by a tattered blanket hung on a rope, his 6-year-old daughter Sarah slept peacefully, her small body curled beneath every blanket and quilt Eli owned. Eli turned his head to look at the wooden crate that served as his bedside table. On it sat a tin cup, a well-worn Bible his late wife had treasured, and 3 silver dollars, all that remained until his next pay at the end of the week. $3 to buy flour, beans, and whatever else he could stretch to feed Sarah for the next 4 days. His mind drifted to Sarah's worn boots, the soles so thin he could see her stockings through the leather. Winter was coming fast to the high desert, and those boots wouldn't last another month. But new boots cost $2 at the general store, and there was always something more pressing: rent for the cabin, oats for their old mule, medicine when Sarah caught a fever. Eli had never imagined his life would turn out this way. 5 years ago, he'd had a wife, a small plot of land he was building into a proper ranch, and dreams of raising cattle and horses. Then the fever had come through Dusty Creek, taking his beloved Anna and leaving him alone with a baby girl and debts from the doctor's failed attempts to save her. The land had to be sold. The dreams had to be buried alongside his wife, and Eli had learned to survive on whatever work he could find, swallowing his pride and accepting that some men were meant to scrape by while others prospered. Through the gaps in the cabin walls, Eli could hear the distant sounds of Dusty Creek settling into its uneasy sleep, a dog barking somewhere down the dirt road, the faint tinkling of an out-of-tune piano from the saloon, the creak of the old windmill by the water trough. These were the sounds of a town that had seen better days, a place where hope came to die under the relentless desert sun. Eli finally felt his eyelids growing heavy, his breathing slowing as exhaustion began to claim him. Tomorrow would bring another day of back-breaking work, another day of stretching $3 into 4 days' worth of survival, another day of watching his daughter grow up in poverty while he worked himself into an early grave. He was just drifting off when he heard it, a sound that didn't belong to the usual nighttime symphony of Dusty Creek. Footsteps, slow, unsteady footsteps crunching across the hard-packed dirt outside his cabin. Eli's eyes snapped open, his hand instinctively reaching for the old Colt revolver he kept hidden beneath his cot. Eli's fingers closed around the worn wooden grip of his Colt revolver as he sat up slowly on his cot, every muscle in his body tensing. The footsteps outside continued, uncertain, shuffling, accompanied by what sounded like someone muttering to themselves in a voice too soft to make out words. In the Arizona territory, unexpected visitors after dark rarely brought good news. It could be drifters looking for an easy target, drunk cowboys spoiling for a fight, or worse, outlaws who knew that isolated cabins on the edge of town made perfect places for robbery without witnesses. Eli glanced toward the alcove where Sarah slept, her small chest rising and falling in peaceful rhythm, completely unaware of the potential danger lurking just beyond their thin cabin walls. His jaw clenched. Whatever was out there, he couldn't let it threaten his daughter. She was all he had left in this world. The footsteps stopped directly outside his door. Then came a sound that made Eli's blood run cold, a weak, trembling knock, 3 soft taps against the weathered wood, barely audible above the desert wind. Knock, knock, knock. Eli rose from his cot, moving with the practiced silence of a man who'd learned to walk without waking a sleeping child. The rough floorboards were cold beneath his bare feet as he crossed the small cabin, his revolver held low but ready. He positioned himself beside the door rather than directly in front of it, a lesson learned from men who'd survived frontier violence. "Who's there?" Eli called out, his voice firm but not loud enough to wake Sarah. "State your business." A woman's voice responded, thin and wavering like dried leaves rustling in the wind. "Please, I'm lost. I can't find my way. Is this the Callaway Ranch? I'm looking for my Victoria." Eli's brow furrowed in confusion. The Callaway Ranch was one of the biggest cattle operations in the territory, but it was a good 30 miles north in Prescott Valley, not anywhere near Dusty Creek. And Victoria Callaway was a name everyone knew, the iron-willed cattle baroness who'd built an empire after her father's death. He pressed his eye to a gap between the door planks and peered out into the moonlit darkness. What he saw made him hesitate, his finger easing away from the trigger of his Colt. An elderly woman stood on his doorstep, swaying slightly as if the wind might knock her over at any moment. She wore a fine wool traveling dress that had once been expensive, but was now covered in dust and desert sand. Her silver hair had come loose from its pins and hung in disheveled strands around her weathered face. In her trembling hands, she clutched a small carpet bag against her chest, like it was the only anchor keeping her tethered to reality. But it was her eyes that struck Eli most, pale blue eyes that stared past his door as if she were seeing something that wasn't there, something from a different time or place entirely. "Ma'am," Eli said more gently, lowering his revolver. "Ma'am, are you all right?" The woman's gaze focused on the door, though Eli wasn't sure she could actually see him through the gaps. "James? Is that you, James? I've been walking for so long. The stagecoach left without me, and I couldn't remember which road to take. Everything looks the same in the dark." Eli felt his chest tighten with a mixture of concern and growing dread. This woman was clearly confused, possibly dangerously so. She might have family searching for her, or she might be alone in the world, wandering the desert until the cold or the coyotes claimed her. Every instinct told him to be careful. A white woman of obvious means showing up at a struggling man's cabin in the dead of night could lead to misunderstandings that might get him hanged from the nearest tree. In the Arizona territory, a man in his position had to be cautious about appearances, about situations that could be twisted into something ugly by people looking for an excuse. But God help him, he couldn't leave an old woman standing in the freezing desert night. "Ma'am, I think you might be lost," Eli said, his hand moving to the door latch. "This isn't the Callaway Ranch. You're in Dusty Creek." Eli's hand hovered over the door latch, his mind racing through the potential consequences of what he was about to do. The wind picked up outside, carrying with it the distant howl of a coyote, and he heard the old woman's teeth chattering even through the wooden door. He thought about the town of Dusty Creek and the people who lived here, hard-scrabble folks who'd learned to mind their own business and keep their heads down. But he also knew how quickly rumors could spread, how a simple act of kindness could be twisted into something sinister by wagging tongues and suspicious minds. A man like him, barely scraping by, taking in a wealthy white woman in the middle of the night. The marshal might come asking questions, the good people of Dusty Creek might start whispering, and if anyone decided to make trouble, Eli had no powerful friends to speak on his behalf, No money for a lawyer, nothing but his word against whatever story someone else might tell. "Please," the woman's voice came again, weaker this time. "I'm so cold. I just need to rest for a moment. Just a moment, and then I'll find my way to Victoria's house." Eli glanced back at the alcove where Sarah slept. His daughter had never known her mother, never known what it was like to have a grandmother's love. Anna's parents had died before Sarah was born, and Eli's own mother had passed when he was just a boy. Sarah's world consisted of a struggling father who worked too much and a drafty cabin that barely kept out the cold. What kind of man would he be if he turned away someone in need? What kind of example would he be setting for his daughter, even if she never knew about this moment? But more than that, Eli thought about Anna. His late wife had possessed a heart bigger than the Arizona sky, always the first to help a neighbor in trouble, always insisting they share what little they had with those who had even less. "We're all just passing through this world, Eli," she used to say. "The only thing that matters is how we treat each other along the way." If Anna were here, she wouldn't hesitate. She'd open that door without a second thought. Eli made his decision. He slid the latch and pulled open the door, the hinges creaking softly in the quiet night. The cold air rushed into the cabin, and with it came the elderly woman, who nearly stumbled over the threshold. Up close, she looked even more fragile than she had through the door gap. Her face was lined with age and exhaustion, her lips tinged blue from the cold. The fine dress she wore was meant for drawing rooms and social calls, not wandering through the desert at night. Burrs clung to her skirts, and one of her expensive leather shoes had lost its heel. "Come in, ma'am," Eli said quietly, reaching out to steady her elbow as she swayed. "Come in and get warm." The woman looked up at him with those confused, pale blue eyes, and for a moment something like recognition flickered across her face. "James," she whispered, reaching up to touch Eli's cheek with a trembling hand. "You came back. I knew you would. I knew you wouldn't leave me out here alone." "My name's Eli, ma'am," he said gently, guiding her toward the chair beside the dying fire. "Eli Tucker, you're safe now. Just sit here and warm yourself." He helped her into the chair, then moved quickly to add more wood to the stove. The flames caught and grew, casting dancing shadows across the cabin walls. The woman held her hands toward the warmth, and Eli could see them shaking. From a nail on the wall, he took down his only spare blanket, a thin woolen thing with more holes than fabric, and draped it carefully around her shoulders. She pulled it close with a grateful sigh, her eyes already beginning to droop with exhaustion. "Thank you, James," she murmured. "You always were such a good boy. Your father would be proud." Eli knelt beside the stove, watching the old woman as the firelight played across her weathered features. He'd crossed a line tonight, made a choice that couldn't be unmade. Whatever came next, he'd have to face it. The first rays of dawn crept through the gaps in the cabin walls, painting thin lines of gold across the rough wooden floor. Eli had barely slept, spending most of the night in his chair, watching over the elderly woman, who now slumbered peacefully near the dying embers of the fire, wrapped in his spare blanket. His back ached from the uncomfortable position, and his eyes felt like they'd been rubbed with desert sand. But more than physical discomfort, a knot of anxiety had taken root in his gut and grown tighter with each passing hour. What had he gotten himself into? The sound of small feet padding across the floor made Eli turn his head. Sarah emerged from behind the blanket curtain, her dark hair tangled from sleep, clutching her corn-husk doll against her chest. Her eyes widened when she saw the stranger sleeping in their cabin. "Papa," Sarah whispered, moving closer to her father's chair. "Who's the lady?" Eli lifted his daughter onto his lap, feeling her small body press against his chest. "She got lost last night, little dove," he said softly, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "She needed somewhere safe to stay, so I let her sleep by our fire." Sarah studied the sleeping woman with the curious intensity only children possess. "Is she sick?" "In a way," Eli replied, choosing his words carefully. Sometimes people get confused and can't remember where they're supposed to be. She thinks she's looking for her daughter, but she can't quite remember how to find her. The elderly woman stirred then, her eyes fluttering open. For a moment she looked around the sparse cabin with clear confusion, taking in the rough walls, the simple furniture, the small child staring at her with innocent curiosity. Then her gaze settled on Eli, and that same distant confusion clouded her features. "James," she said uncertainly, "where are we? This isn't our house." "No, ma'am," Eli said gently, setting Sarah down and moving to kneel beside the woman's chair. "I am Eli Tucker. You came to my cabin last night. You were looking for the Callaway Ranch, remember? Looking for someone named Victoria?" Martha, though Eli still didn't know her name, pressed her fingers to her temples as if trying to physically push the memories into place. "Victoria, yes, my daughter. She has the ranch now, the big house with the white pillars. But I can't." She trailed off, her face crumpling with frustration and fear. "I can't remember how to get there." Sarah approached cautiously, extending her corn-husk doll toward the old woman. "When I'm sad, my dolly helps me feel better," she said, with the simple wisdom of childhood. "You can hold her if you want." Martha's face transformed, tears welling in her pale blue eyes as she looked at the child. She took the offered doll with trembling hands, cradling it as if it were made of spun glass. "You're so kind, dear child. What's your name?" "Sarah," the girl replied, moving closer without fear. "Sarah Ann Tucker. I'm 6 years old." "6 years old," Martha repeated, a sad smile crossing her lips. "My Victoria was 6 once, so long ago now. She used to bring me wildflowers from the fields, great bunches of them that made the whole house smell like sunshine." Eli stood and moved to the small wooden shelf that served as his pantry. His heart sank as he took inventory: a half sack of cornmeal, some dried beans, a small tin of lard, and 2 strips of salted pork he'd been saving for Sunday dinner. Enough to feed himself and Sarah for the rest of the week if he stretched it carefully. But adding a third mouth? He thought about the 3 silver dollars in his pocket. He was supposed to work the afternoon shift at the Silver Spur today, which would earn him another $1 in wages, plus whatever tips the cowboys felt generous enough to leave. But he couldn't leave Sarah alone with a confused stranger, and he couldn't take them both to the saloon. "Papa, I'm hungry," Sarah said, tugging on his worn trouser leg. Martha looked up at Eli with those lost, confused eyes. "Is it breakfast time?" "I should make breakfast for everyone. I used to make the most wonderful flapjacks. Victoria loved them with butter and honey." Eli made a decision. He pulled on his boots and his hat, then grabbed his coat from the peg by the door. "I need to go to Henderson's general store," he said, more to himself than to the others. "Sarah, you stay here with our guest. Don't open the door for anyone but me. Understand?" Sarah nodded solemnly, already climbing into the chair beside Martha, who had begun telling her a rambling story about a little girl and a garden full of roses. Eli stepped out into the cold morning air, the 3 silver dollars heavy in his pocket. He was about to spend money he couldn't afford, to feed a stranger he didn't know, and potentially miss work he desperately needed. But as he walked toward town, he could hear Sarah's delighted laughter floating through the cabin walls, a sound he hadn't heard nearly enough of lately. Henderson's general store sat at the end of Dusty Creek's main street, its faded sign creaking in the morning breeze. Eli pushed through the door, the bell above jingling to announce his arrival. The familiar smell of coffee, tobacco, and dry goods filled his nostrils as his eyes adjusted to the dimmer interior. Mr. Henderson stood behind the counter, a portly man with wire-rimmed spectacles perched on his bulbous nose. He looked up from his ledger and nodded at Eli with the perfunctory greeting of a shopkeeper who knew his customer's credit was stretched thin. "Tucker," Henderson said, his tone neither friendly nor unfriendly. "Bit early for you, isn't it? Thought you worked afternoons. Need some supplies, Eli replied, moving toward the shelf where the cornmeal and flour sat in burlap sacks. He grabbed what he needed: a small sack of flour, some eggs, a jar of preserves, and a tin of coffee. Luxuries he normally couldn't justify, but he couldn't serve their guests the meager rations he and Sarah survived on. As Henderson tallied up the items, his practiced eye calculating the cost, the bell above the door jingled again. Miguel Reyes walked in, Eli's friend and fellow worker from the Silver Spur. Miguel's weathered face broke into a grin when he saw Eli. "Amigo," Miguel called out, then noticed the unusual purchases Eli was making. His smile faded slightly. "Everything all right? That's a lot of food for the middle of the week." Before Eli could respond, two more men entered the store, ranch hands from one of the bigger spreads, their spurs jingling as they walked. They headed toward the tobacco counter, but Eli noticed them, glancing his way with interest. "I've got a situation," Eli said quietly to Miguel, keeping his voice low. "An old woman showed up at my cabin last night, lost and confused. Says she's looking for her daughter at the Callaway Ranch." Miguel's eyes widened. "The Callaway Ranch?" "That's Victoria Callaway's spread. You're telling me—" "I don't know who she is," Eli interrupted, "but she's not well. Her mind wanders. She can't remember things properly. I couldn't just leave her out in the cold." "Dios mío, Eli," Miguel whispered, glancing around to make sure no one was listening. "You know how this could look? A woman like that in your cabin?" "That'll be $2.40, Henderson announced loudly, making both men jump. Eli's stomach dropped. $2.40. That left him with only 60 cents until payday. No margin for error, no buffer if something went wrong. He pulled out his silver dollars and counted them onto the counter, watching his financial security disappear. As Henderson bagged his purchases, one of the ranch hands sauntered over, a tall man with a thick mustache and the swagger of someone who'd never missed a meal. "Couldn't help but overhear," he said, his voice carrying across the small store. "You got one of the Callaway women at your place?" The store went quiet. Even Henderson stopped his bagging to listen. "I've got a lost woman who needs help finding her family," Eli said carefully, meeting the ranch hand's eyes. "That's all." "The Callaway family's been looking for old Martha since yesterday afternoon," the ranch hand continued, louder now. "Got riders out searching. Posted notices in Prescott Valley and every town in between. Seems the old lady wandered off from her daughter's ranch during a garden party." Eli felt ice form in his veins. Martha. So that was her name. And if her family was searching, if there were notices posted, then every hour he kept her was another hour that could be misunderstood. "Word is, there's a reward," the other ranch hand added, moving closer. $50 for information leading to her safe return. $50. More money than Eli made in 2 months. The number hung in the air like a golden promise, tempting and terrible. "Where'd you say your cabin was, Tucker?" the first ranch hand asked, his tone shifting from curious to calculating. Miguel stepped between them, his hand resting casually on his belt near where Eli knew he kept a knife. "He didn't say," Miguel replied evenly, "and I think he's got business to attend to." "Right, amigo?" Eli grabbed his bag of supplies, his mind racing. He needed to get Martha back to her family immediately, before rumors started spreading, before someone decided to involve the marshal, before his simple act of kindness became something dark and twisted in the retelling. "I need your help," Eli said to Miguel as they hurried out of the store. "I need to get her to Prescott Valley, to the Callaway Ranch. But I can't leave Sarah alone, and I can't afford a wagon." Miguel was quiet for a moment, then sighed. "My cousin has a buckboard. I can borrow it, but Eli, you're supposed to work this afternoon. If you don't show up, Patterson will fire you. You know he's been looking for an excuse." Eli looked back toward his cabin, where his daughter was sitting with a confused old woman who thought he was someone named James. He thought about the 3 silver dollars, now reduced to 60 cents. He thought about the job he was about to lose and the consequences that would follow. But he also thought about what Anna would say if she were here. She'd tell him that some things mattered more than money or jobs. Some things were worth the risk. "I'll deal with Patterson later," Eli said. "Right now, I need to get Martha home." The buckboard wagon rattled along the dusty trail toward Prescott Valley, its wooden wheels protesting every rut and stone in the road. Miguel handled the reins, while Eli sat in the back with Sarah and Martha, the old woman wrapped in blankets against the afternoon heat that seemed to sap strength from everything living. Martha had been quiet for most of the journey, her eyes fixed on the passing landscape as if trying to remember something just beyond her reach. Occasionally she would murmur about gardens and parties, about a little girl with ribbons in her hair, about a husband named James who'd been gone for so many years. Sarah sat close to the old woman, holding her hand and chattering away about her corn-husk doll, about the lizards she'd seen that morning, about anything that might bring a smile to Martha's confused face. As they crested a hill, the Callaway Ranch spread out before them like a vision from another world. White fences stretched for miles across green pastures where hundreds of cattle grazed. The main house stood 3 stories tall, its white pillars gleaming in the sunlight, surrounded by manicured gardens that seemed impossibly lush in the harsh desert territory. Eli had never seen wealth like this before. It made his small cabin seem even more pathetic by comparison, made his 3 silver dollars, now 60 cents, feel like pocket lint. "Victoria," Martha whispered, sitting up straighter as recognition flickered in her eyes. "That's Victoria's house. I remember now. I was at the garden party, and I thought I saw James by the roses. I followed him, but he kept walking, and I got turned around." Miguel guided the buckboard up the long drive toward the main house, passing ranch hands who stopped their work to stare at the worn wagon and its unusual passengers. Before they reached the house, the front door burst open and a woman emerged at a near run, her emerald riding dress billowing behind her. Victoria Callaway was perhaps 40 years old, tall and striking with her mother's pale blue eyes and silver-streaked dark hair, pulled back in an elegant knot. But her face was drawn with worry, her eyes red-rimmed from what Eli suspected had been a sleepless night. "Mother!" Victoria's voice cracked with relief and anguish as she rushed toward the wagon. "Oh, God! Mother, where have you been?" Martha's face lit up with sudden clarity, the confusion lifting like morning fog. "Victoria? Victoria, darling, why are you crying? I just went for a little walk." Eli helped Martha down from the wagon, and Victoria immediately swept her mother into her arms, holding her close as tears streamed down her face. "A little walk? Mother, you've been gone for nearly 2 days. We've had every ranch hand in 3 counties searching for you." 2 men emerged from the house, one the local doctor, the other a man in a marshal's badge. Eli felt his stomach clench at the sight of the lawman, but the marshal's attention was focused entirely on Martha, his expression more relieved than suspicious. Victoria finally released her mother and turned to face Eli, Miguel, and Sarah. Her gaze swept over them, taking in their worn clothing, the borrowed buckboard, the obvious signs of poverty. When she spoke, her voice was thick with emotion. "You found her," Victoria said simply. "You brought her home." "She showed up at my cabin 2 nights ago, ma'am," Eli explained, removing his hat respectfully. "She was confused and cold. I couldn't leave her out in the desert, so I gave her shelter. Soon as I learned who she was and that you were searching, I brought her here as fast as I could." The doctor was already examining Martha, checking her vitals while asking gentle questions about how she felt. Martha tolerated his fussing with good humor, more interested in telling him about the nice young man named James who'd taken such good care of her. Victoria approached Eli slowly, studying his face with an intensity that made him uncomfortable. "She called you James?" "Yes, ma'am." I didn't correct her when she seemed so certain, didn't want to upset her more. "James was my father," Victoria said softly. "He died 15 years ago. Mother's memory. It comes and goes. The doctor says it will only get worse with time. She paused, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper. She wandered away from a garden party. One moment she was admiring the roses, the next she was gone. We searched everywhere, sent riders in every direction, I thought. Her voice broke. I thought I'd lost her. Sarah tugged on Eli's sleeve. Is Miss Martha going to be okay now, Papa? Victoria's attention shifted to the little girl, and something softened in her expression. She knelt down to Sarah's level. What's your name, sweetheart? Sarah Ann Tucker, the girl replied. That's my papa. He takes good care of people. Victoria looked up at Eli, and he saw tears gathering in her eyes again. Yes, she said quietly. Yes, he does. Victoria Calloway rose to her feet, her gaze never leaving Eli's face. She studied him for a long moment. The worn hat in his calloused hands, the faded shirt with its carefully mended patches, the boots that had seen better years. Then she looked at Sarah, whose dress was clean but threadbare, and at Miguel standing awkwardly by the buckboard, clearly uncomfortable in the presence of such wealth. Mr. Tucker, Victoria said finally, her voice regaining its natural authority, would you come inside? I'd like to speak with you privately. Eli's throat went dry. Private conversations with powerful people rarely went well for men in his position. Ma'am, I should probably be getting back to Dusty Creek. I've got work. Please, Victoria interrupted. And there was something in her tone that wasn't quite a command, but wasn't a request either. It won't take long. Your daughter and friend are welcome to wait in the parlor. My housekeeper will bring them some refreshments. Miguel caught Eli's eye and gave a small nod of encouragement. There was no polite way to refuse, and truthfully, Eli was curious about what Victoria Calloway wanted to say that required privacy. They left Sarah in the care of a kind-faced Mexican woman who immediately began fussing over the little girl, offering cookies and milk. Martha was being helped upstairs by the doctor, already looking more like herself in familiar surroundings. Eli followed Victoria down a hallway lined with paintings and into a study that smelled of leather and tobacco. The room was masculine, clearly her late father's space that she had claimed as her own. A massive desk dominated one wall, covered with ledgers and maps of ranch holdings. Books lined floor-to-ceiling shelves, and through the window, the vast Calloway empire stretched as far as the eye could see. Victoria gestured for Eli to sit in one of the leather chairs facing the desk, but he remained standing, hat still clutched in his hands. She seemed to understand his discomfort and remained standing as well, moving to look out the window at her land. Do you know what it's like, Mr. Tucker? Victoria began, her voice quiet. To have everything in the world except the one thing that matters most? She didn't wait for an answer. I built this ranch into what it is today. When my father died, people said a woman couldn't run a cattle operation. They said I'd lose everything within a year. I proved them wrong. I'm worth more than most men in this territory will ever see in 10 lifetimes. She turned to face him, and Eli was struck by the raw emotion in her eyes. But my mother is all I have left of my family. My father is gone. My husband died 5 years ago in a riding accident. I never had children. Mother is everything to me, and her mind is slipping away a little more each day. When she disappeared, Victoria's voice caught. When she disappeared, I would have traded everything, this ranch, every head of cattle, every acre, just to have her back safely. Eli shifted uncomfortably, unsure where this conversation was heading. You could have ignored her, Victoria continued, moving closer. You could have sent her away or left her at the marshal's office. Instead, you took her into your home. You fed her with food you clearly couldn't afford. You gave her your blanket, your comfort, your care. And when you learned who she was, you brought her home immediately, asking for nothing in return. Anyone would have done the same, ma'am, Eli said quietly. No, Victoria said firmly. They wouldn't have. I've learned that most people, when they see an opportunity, they take it. They calculate what they can gain, but you—" She reached into her desk drawer and pulled out a leather pouch that clinked with the sound of coins. "The reward for my mother's return is $50. You've earned it 10 times over." She held out the pouch, but Eli didn't take it. $50 would change his life, pay his rent for 6 months, buy Sarah new boots and a winter coat, maybe even let him quit one of his jobs and spend more time with his daughter. But something about accepting payment for basic human decency felt wrong, like it would cheapen what he'd done. "Ma'am, I didn't help your mother for money," Eli said. "I did it because it was the right thing to do." Victoria's eyes glistened with fresh tears. "I know, that's exactly why you deserve far more than $50. She set the pouch on the desk and pulled out a piece of paper, dipping a pen in ink. "Mr. Tucker, what do you do for work?" "I work at Henderson's ranch mucking stalls, and I serve drinks at the Silver Spur Saloon," Eli replied, confused by the question. "And you support your daughter on those wages?" "We get by," Eli said, though the words felt hollow even as he spoke them. Victoria wrote something on the paper with decisive strokes. "I need a foreman for my northern range. The job pays $60 a month, plus a house on the property. A real house with multiple rooms, a proper roof, and a well. There's a small school nearby where your daughter could attend classes with the other ranch children." Eli's heart began to pound. $60 a month was more than he made in 3 months at both his current jobs combined. A real house for Sarah, instead of their drafty cabin. A school with actual teachers and books. "Ma'am, I appreciate the offer, but I don't know the first thing about being a foreman," Eli said, even as hope surged through his chest. "I can't manage men or—" "Those things can be taught," Victoria interrupted. "What can't be taught is character. What can't be taught is the kind of man who sacrifices his last few dollars to care for a stranger. The kind of man who risks his job and his reputation to do what's right." She held out the paper, a formal contract. "I need men I can trust, Mr. Tucker. Men with integrity. Those are rarer than gold in this territory and far more valuable." Eli stared at the contract, his hands trembling slightly. "Why?" he whispered. "Why would you do this for me?" Victoria smiled, and for the first time the expression reached her eyes. "Because when my mother was lost and vulnerable and confused, you didn't see a burden or a problem. You saw someone who needed help, and you helped her. You gave her dignity. You treated her with kindness. In my experience, Mr. Tucker, that says everything I need to know about the kind of man you are." She pressed the contract into his hands. "Take it. Read it. Think about it if you need to, but know that this offer is genuine, and it comes with my deepest gratitude for bringing my mother home safely." Eli looked down at the paper, at the neat script that spelled out terms he'd never dreamed possible. His vision blurred with tears, he quickly blinked away. For the first time since Anna died, he felt like maybe, just maybe, there was hope for something better. 6 months later, the Arizona sun climbed over the eastern hills, painting the Callaway Northern Range in shades of gold and amber. Eli Tucker stood on the porch of his foreman's house, a sturdy wooden structure with glass windows, a stone fireplace, and 3 separate rooms, sipping coffee from a real porcelain cup as he watched the ranch come to life. The corrals were already bustling with activity as ranch hands prepared for the day's work. Cattle lowed in the distance, and somewhere near the barn he could hear Miguel's distinctive laugh as he joked with the other men. Victoria had hired Miguel as assistant foreman within a month of Eli taking the position, and having his friend by his side had made the transition smoother than Eli could have hoped. Through the window behind him, Eli could hear Sarah's voice as she practiced her reading lesson, stumbling over words but pressing forward with determination. The small ranch school had transformed his daughter in ways that still amazed him. She could read now, write her letters, and do arithmetic. She had friends, children her own age, who invited her to birthday parties and played games during recess. But more than her education, Sarah had something Eli had feared she might never have: stability. She had a real bed with a quilt Victoria had given them, a shelf full of books, and 3 dresses instead of 1. She ate 3 meals a day and never went to bed hungry. The worry that had lined her small face in Dusty Creek had melted away, replaced by the carefree joy that children were meant to possess. The sound of an approaching carriage drew Eli's attention. He recognized it immediately, Victoria's personal buggy, driven by her regular coachman. Every Sunday, like clockwork, Victoria arrived with her mother for dinner and an afternoon visit. Eli set down his coffee cup and walked down the porch steps to greet them. Martha emerged first, moving more slowly than she had 6 months ago, but her face lit up when she saw him. "James," she called out, and Eli no longer corrected her. The doctors had confirmed that her confusion was deepening, that she lived more and more in memories of the past. If calling him by her late husband's name brought her comfort, Eli was content to be James for her. "Good morning, ma'am," Eli said warmly, offering his arm to help her up the porch steps. "Sarah's been asking about you all morning. She wants to show you her new reading book." Victoria followed, carrying a basket covered with a checkered cloth. "Fresh bread and some of that apple butter Mother made," she explained. She insisted on bringing it herself. Inside, Sarah squealed with delight at seeing Martha and immediately dragged her to the small parlor to display her schoolwork. Martha settled into the rocking chair, the same one she'd insisted on giving them from her own bedroom, and listened with rapt attention as Sarah read haltingly from her primer. Victoria and Eli stood in the kitchen, and she smiled at the domestic scene before them. "Mother's better on Sundays," Victoria said quietly. "Knowing she has this visit to look forward to gives her good days. The doctor thinks it's because she's happy." "Sarah lives for these visits too," Eli replied, watching his daughter's animated face as she showed Martha a drawing she'd made. "She asks every morning if today is Sunday." Victoria turned to look at him, her expression thoughtful. "You've done well here, Eli. Better than I expected, and my expectations were high. The men respect you, the work gets done efficiently. You've increased productivity on this range by 15%. Eli felt heat creep up his neck at the praise. "I just try to treat folks fairly and lead by example." "Exactly," Victoria said. "That's why it works." She paused, then added, "I've been thinking about expanding operations into New Mexico territory. I'll need someone to oversee that venture, someone I trust completely." Eli's eyes widened. "Ma'am, Not today," Victoria interrupted with a gentle smile. "Just something to think about. For now, enjoy your Sunday dinner. I believe Mother is already making plans for what she wants to teach Sarah this afternoon." As if on cue, Martha's voice drifted from the parlor. "Sarah, dear, when I was your age, my mother taught me to make flower crowns from desert blooms. Would you like to learn?" Eli watched through the doorway as Sarah clapped her hands with excitement, and Martha's face glowed with purpose and joy. 2 people who'd been lost, one in confusion, one in poverty, had somehow found each other, and in finding each other, had found something to hold on to. That evening, after Victoria and Martha had left, and Sarah was tucked into bed with her corn-husk doll and a goodnight kiss, Eli stood once more on his porch. The stars blazed overhead in the clear desert sky, more numerous than all the cattle in the territory. He thought about that freezing night 6 months ago when he'd heard footsteps outside his cabin. He thought about the choice he'd made, the risk he'd taken, the $3 silver he'd spent without knowing if he'd eat the following week. At the time, it had seemed like such a small thing, just offering shelter to someone in need. But that small act of kindness had rippled outward in ways he never could have imagined, changing not just his life and Sarah's, but Martha's and Victoria's as well. Eli had learned something profound in these past months, that wealth wasn't measured in dollars or acres or heads of cattle. Real wealth was measured in the connections between people, in the kindness shared between strangers, in the willingness to help someone even when it cost you something you couldn't afford to give. He'd given Martha shelter when he had almost nothing, and in return, he'd received everything he'd ever hoped for. Not just material security, but purpose, community, and the knowledge that he was raising his daughter to understand what truly mattered in life. Sometimes, Eli reflected as he turned to go inside, the best investments we make are the ones that don't make sense on paper, the ones that come from the heart instead of the head, the ones that remind us that we're all just travelers on this earth, and the only thing that lasts beyond our time here is how we treated each other along the way. Behind him, the desert wind whispered through the sagebrush, carrying with it the promise of another day, another chance to do right by the people who depended on him, another opportunity to prove that kindness, real, genuine kindness, was never wasted. Inside the house, Sarah's music box played softly, a gift from Martha that played a gentle lullaby. The sound drifted through the open window, a reminder that sometimes the most beautiful things in life come from the most unexpected places. And it all started with a single choice on a cold desert night, to open a door when it would have been easier to keep it closed.